Jonathan Osterman remembered the taste of metal in his mouth, the way other men remembered the taste of rain. Both were small sensory facts that the rest of the universe had folded into a geometry of consequence. He remembered the clock, the wrong angle of light, the way probability had sliced his life into before and after. And he remembered with the cool precision that now defined him, the day he stopped being only a man. Time for him was not a line, but a library in which every page lay open. He watched his own childhood sitting beside his eventual death as if both were inked simultaneously. And in that view, his choices unspooled like slow equations. He had stood at the edge of humanity and watched the whole of it tilt. And in the tilt he had learned that facts about matter were secondary to facts about meaning. On a night when the stars seemed brittle and cities hummed with indifferent electricity, the sky over Kansas fractured for reasons that were not immediately visible to any single mortal chart. An echo of a dead world, humming through the lattice of probability, a pattern of violence collapsing into possibility and then reassembling as intent. From the laboratory deserts of a world that no longer had a name, something had been engineered to refuse extinction, a thing honed by survival into a single imperative: annihilate what stands between you and the next breath of being. The thing wore no philosophy. It wore teeth and a history of deaths from which it learned how to be death more correctly the next time. It was called Doomsday by those who knew its legend, and named it nothing at all by those who felt only the press of a tidal fist on their planet. Doomsday arrived like a rumor of tectonic failure, like weather that eats cities, and every clash it survived taught it to be more of itself. When cities collapsed beneath its steps, the record of that collapse wrote itself into the architecture of its cells, until those cells were not cells but axioms. If a force could be described as a sentence, Doomsday was repetition turned into law. Jonathan, who had learned to look at the world as if he could edit the grammar of nature, watched that sentence appear in the margins of his timeline, and felt for the first time in an age, an ethical irritation. The blue did not make him warm, it made him geometrically precise. Here was an agent whose continued existence guaranteed future filaments of suffering that would be cruel and purposeless. Doomsday did not hate, Doomsday did not seek meaning, it reduced the space in which meaning might grow. In the fire and glass of the first reports, satellites gone, seafloors upturned, cities like excised organs, Manhattan catalogued not only power but potentiality. He saw the future in which Doomsday became more than brute force, an adaptive law that crept into weapons, into ecosystems, into the emergent orders of sentient beings, until killing became an algorithm that could not be reasoned with. It was then that the debate, which had been a private calculus in Jonathan's mind for many quiet decades, found its interlocutor. The question he posed to the thing that had no tongue was not rhetorical. He addressed it as one would address a wound. Why do you? The thing answered without words by being what it was. Every assault it endured and survived was an answer. Jonathan reflected on necessity and contingency, on the ethics of erasure. He had, in earlier ages of his new existence, learned that removing a fact from history was not the same as inventing a better world. He had seen the eddies of causality where a single excision rewrote joys and tragedies alike. To stop Doomsday by rewriting the birth of a monster might also unmake the children who would grow up to heal other wounds, the accidents that led to inventions now central to human flourishing. To act was to risk being a tyrant of outcome. To not act was to allow a deterministic predator to hollow the future. He interrogated his detachment and found, with an honesty that astonished him, a moral impatience. He could see every branch of consequence concurrently, and in those branches the pattern repeated. Doomsday was not merely an enemy to be fought. Doomsday was a metastasis of possibility. The deepest philosophical discussion in his mind became simple. Is existence merely the right to persist? Or is it the mutual field in which agents can make meaning? If the former, then nothing could morally stand in the way of a thing that adapted to survive. If the latter, then there was a prima facie duty to remove agents that systematically extinguished the possibility of meaning for others. Somewhere between atom and idea, Jonathan found a criterion he allowed himself to test. Preserve the possibility for autonomous being to pursue value. The question then turned operational. How to stop a thing that learned to survive by becoming immune to what had killed it before? without rippling the cosmos into unrecognizable shapes. He contemplated erasure as a scalpel and as a blunt instrument. He thought of sending Doomsday to an infinite bank of rejected probabilities, where it could run against itself forever, a Hardy's paradox of self-consuming iterations. He thought of undoing the laboratory on the dead world, of severing the ancestral thread that wound into the present. He knew with his particular kind of grief that any act he took would be both surgical and violent. He also knew that the creature before him would not permit negotiation, for negotiation implied a history of reason, and Doomsday was proof that reason does not always predominate. So he prepared himself not as a combatant, but as an editor of ontology. He allowed the city to form his cloak. He let the slow, indifferent hum of human lives and their small tendernesses compose the standard by which he would judge the calculus. He walked toward the locus of the storm, not because he wished to show force, but because in the petri dish of encounter he would determine not only a victor, but a verdict about what existence meant for the rest of the world. Doomsday came like inevitability, and man who had once been a clockmaker's apprentice, and then a god who could rearrange the stars, chose to bring to the meeting not triumph, but an argument, to let physics and ethics entwine until the act of victory itself answered the question. His thought had raged. When the two met, there was no audience fit to hold the scale of consequence. Mountains left their roots and drifted like severed thoughts, and oceans heaved to make room for a single trajectory of madness. Doomsday stepped from a world rent like an axiom made flesh, bone and hide oscillating with the lessons of 1,000 deaths. Manhattan observed the creature in the same way he observed an atom. Its logic, its vector, its history. Then he unfolded his hand and the air around Doomsday became a lattice of possibilities. The first exchange was simple and terrible. Doomsday closed on the blue presence with the grammar of annihilation and struck. A fist did more than hit. It attempted to unwrite. Manhattan felt his form compress into scattering equations and responded by reducing Doomsday's molecules to their probability states, letting the creature become a rain of intended positions and then pulling them apart like a jeweler separating settings from gems. Doomsday reconstituted not in confusion but in learning, an immunity grafted onto complaint. It lunged and took a bite out of probability, and Manhattan found himself struck in a way that was not physical so much as categorical. Someone had learned how to chew on the idea of a thing that could not be killed by being killed. That was Doomsday's gift and curse. Each death taught it how to prevent the next death, with an efficiency that was merciless in its clarity. Manhattan escalated by dissolving ecosystems around Doomsday, by turning mountain ranges into outreaching lattices of heat, so the creature would have to learn anew how solidity meant resist. Doomsday adapted instantly, replacing collagen with a lattice that conducted vibrational shock like a tuned instrument, the way evolution builds a new bridge after an old one falls. The two warred across ontological registers, Manhattan from the strata of possibility, Doomsday from the strata of adaptation, and for a cosmos of a few breaths, it was a contest between editing and habituation. Manhattan tried the heavy hand fracture causality and showed Doomsday a past in which there was no laboratory, no ordered breeding of slaughter. He reached and touched the event that birthed the thing and saw all the ripples that unmaking would cause, entire lines of innovation, folded out of the map, kindnesses never given, healers unborn. To excise one node was to redraw the topology of agency across centuries. The moral arithmetic was harsh. Doomsday, unseeing, became a proof that naive eradication can be an injustice as real as the violence it seeks to remove. Manhattan hesitated, and in that hesitation Doomsday's adaptation accelerated until it had learned not only to survive particular assaults, but to resist alteration in principle. It clawed at probability itself, at the seams where reality stitched its garments, and the fabric frayed. Manhattan felt for the first time since he became a god of scales and clocks, the weight of an ethical choice pressing against the fact of power. He could unmake, but what he would unmake would be more than an enemy. He could attempt to exile Doomsday to a probability basin where it could rage forever without touching any history, but that risked creating a Gordian prison from which some later cunning being might fish the pattern back into being. His solution emerged not out of domination, but out of a philosophic compromise that married his ontology to a moral imperative. If meaning thrives where agents can pursue values autonomous, then a persistent predator that metastasizes possibility into algorithmic extinction must be neutralized by removing its capacity to iterate, not by reverting past. He folded his perception inward and reached for the predicate that constituted Doomsday, the structural rule that allowed its adaptation to propagate across time. He did not rip the creature's history from being. He abstracted the rule and placed it into a metric field cut off from causal anchoring, a place where a rule could chase its own tail without anchoring a history. It was a surgical extraction. The adaptive law that made Doomsday a perpetual lesson was separated from the matter that carried it. Doomsday, for one shuddering heartbeat, felt the absence as a shiver of wrongness, like a language losing its consonants. It struck as hard as an entire planet, but struck only skin without the adaptive imperative. It was monstrously strong and also monstrously finite. Manhattan, who could not be surprised by what would come next because he had already seen it, allowed the creature to exist in a moment that was effectively a cul-de-sac of causation. There it raged until its cells, untended by principle, exhausted the momentum of their own aggression. The last thing Doomsday did was look at him with a clarity that was not malice but recognition, a brute force acknowledging an immaterial authority. Manhattan held his hand out and did not obliterate. He removed the vector that would let obliteration become a self-propagating law. The creature did not win. It did not become a lesson for the future. It stopped. The world reconstituted around the cessation with a tenderness Manhattan had not expected. People woke with memories like scars and songs like map. The cost was real. Some lines of history altered in the margins where Manhattan's intervention had pruned possibility, but the net of agents who could continue to seek value remained intact, and in his measure, afterwards, standing where the storm had been, Jonathan considered the enterprise of victory. He had not shown brute superiority in the way myths like to tell it. He had not simply proven a stronger fist, but he had exercised a more comprehensive sovereignty, the power to judge the shape of being and to choose a remedy that preserved the capacity of others to make meaning. Doomsday had been powerful because it could make adaptation absolute. Manhattan was powerful because he could make the condition of adaptation conditional. In the ledger of forces, the creature that learned from death had been outmatched by the mind that could reason about the value of living. The winner, when all the dust settled and the moral balance was tallied, not in broken mountains but in possible futures, was not the one who could break most things fastest, but the one who could preserve the space in which futures can still be formed. Manhattan had the capacity to erase a history, but more importantly, he had the patience to choose a correction that kept most lives whole. Doomsday had been stopped, not by a blow but by the excision of the rule that would let it become endless. The verdict lay quiet as the blue light dimmed. The world would continue, and in the calculus of consequence, Dr. Manhattan remained the steward with the last, coldly moral word.